You know, we find raised bed gardens to be a great complement to our container gardens. Generally, when our containers are done for the year, we dump out the potting mix that's just packed with roots. And that goes into our, what we call our feel-good pile, which is just our open composting pile. And generally by next season, that material is ready to go into our raised beds. At the end of the season, after we've pulled everything out of our raised beds, we take out the old lawnmower with the bagger and chop up all the leaves that are on the yard. And some of those leaves will spread on top of our raised beds. We'll put a good 2-inch layer of chopped leaves and put them to bed for the winter. Come spring, when they thaw, we'll take a digging fork and dig them in, turn those leaves in. And within a matter of just a couple of weeks, they are packed with earthworms. It's amazing. Little short, fat, stubby worms. And they're breaking down those leaves and adding that nutrients to the potting mix, to the soil. And we're basically mimicking what happens in the forests in our raised beds. So there are many advantages to raised bed gardening. Now, I first came across it in 1983 with my buddy Tom. We were in Peace Corps in Central African Republic, and we took a vacation to Gabon. And we went to this bar restaurant, and the owner told us all about this new method that wasn't new to him, it was new to us, the French intensive method. And for his border material, in typical African appropriate technology fashion, being a bar owner, he had beer and wine bottles, and he inverted them necks down, and those were his borders. He had about, I don't know, a dozen of them or so. And he explained to us that he could control the quality of the soil. He could compost material and add a good quality soil to the otherwise rock-hard laterite soil found in equatorial Africa. And then the real benefit came while we were there. There was one of those torrential rainy season downpours, and the whole area was just flooded. But his bed stayed high and dry. Well, not dry, but high. I'll dig up a photograph of that and try to embed it in this video, if I remember how to do that. But the advantages of these raised beds are many. First of all, as we mentioned, you can control the quality of the potting mix, the soil that goes into them. Being raised, and especially being raised with metal sides, the soil in them thaws well before the surrounding ground here in northern Minnesota. So once they warm, we can turn those leaves in. They're also attractive, and they allow us to put a garden wherever we want to plop one of these raised beds and put in a garden. We don't need to dig out a rototiller and make these big garden beds like we used to do. We used to have garden beds all over the place, had the big walk behind rear tine mower, rototiller and all of that business. We've done away with all of that. We find our raised beds, a few of these raised beds, combined with our self-watering planters, give us as much produce as we want with minimal labor. So once the plants are up in these beds, it's only June 7th or 8th, so there's not much planted in them yet. We have some Swiss chard and beets, that's some Asian spinach, we have some squash, summer and winter squash planted there. We have leeks, scallions, no, I'm sorry, shallots that I started from seed. Those are shallots I started from sets. And once the plants are up, we'll get out more chopped leaves we saved back from last fall. We just bag them all up because we just can't get enough of those chopped leaves. And we'll spread those over between the plants and mulch our raised beds, and greatly reduces the amount of watering and weeding. Now we started using corrugated metal, and this is the wider corrugations on this metal. Back when we started building these, they were $10 for an 8-foot sheet. And so I was just using off-the-rack 2x4s, 8-foot 2x4s. That one's a 12-footer, but mostly they're 8-footers. They're about less than $3 a piece. Just not treated, just regular 2x4s, and then I stained them with a latex solid colored stain. It's the cedar color. It kind of looks a little like cedar. So the real advantages to that were that these were really inexpensive to build. They were about $30 a piece to build. There's also no wood in contact with the ground, so they don't rot. And we find they're attractive. They're lightweight. They're easy to build, easy to move around. You know, the downside, I can see this one. This one's probably, oh gosh, 3 or 4 years old. It's starting to get a little bit soft there in the corner. So out of all of these, there's one little spot of rot there that I'll probably, after a couple more years, I'll just take the screws out and pop that cap off and screw on a new 2x4. Not a big deal. But since we made these, we came up with a new method. And we decided to go with cedar for a couple of reasons. It's a little more, or substantially more, rot resistant. I think it's more attractive. It has more curb appeal. And it's almost double the price. Especially if you use 2x4s, it's more like triple the price. So what I did is I got the 5/4 cedar decking. It's actually 1 1/8 inches thick, and I ripped those in half. So I could build an 8-foot raised bed using 3 of those decking planks. And they're about, you know, between $11 and $13 a piece. So you roughly doubled the cost of the lumber. You could go with 1x4. You see people have used that. But that's a little too thin for me. For putting screws in, capping, it's not quite substantial enough. That 5/4 decking is about as thin as I'd want to go. So you have a couple of choices. You could either use just regular 2x4s, splurge and buy cedar 2x4s, or do what we do and just rip that 5/4 decking. Now the other option, of course, is to use treated lumber, but that's something we are avoiding. When we bought this place, we inherited a big old pile of treated lumber behind our pole barn. And trying to do the right thing, I hauled it to the transfer station and it cost us $100 to dispose of that. And the years that I was working with it myself, you know, you're always breathing the dust and, you know, sawdust, and I just don't want to work with it anymore. So we don't buy treated lumber for anything unless there's a project I need to sink some posts down in the ground or something, and then I think that's probably an appropriate use for it. But why don't we head over and take a look at one of these cedar beds that I just put 2 of them in yesterday. Well, there's one other thing. Our beds are 8 inches high. One 8-foot piece of corrugated metal will build an 8-foot planter, cutting them in 8-inch strips. So you get 12 of those. Now, I know people out there, a lot of people think you need a higher raised bed because it's more convenient. You don't have to bend over so far and all of that. Well, if you want to do that, you've got a lot more soil and a lot more energy than I do, because one of these 8-foot beds holds 21 cubic feet of soil. That's 5 or 6 of our little Kubota tractor loads full of topsoil and in the previous year's potting mix and compost, all hauled in, and that's plenty for me. So let's head over there. On our way over there, here's one more that we have against the south side of the garage. It's not planted yet. So these planters are made from the 5/4 cedar decking that's been ripped in half and glued and screwed together, And then the other change besides the type of wood that we used is we went with the mini corrugations on these, and they're like $3 a sheet more. Now the price just went up, but remember we only need one sheet to do an 8-foot planter. So they are $14.97 for a sheet of the mini corrugations, which I think are a little more appealing. So yesterday I dug up the sod. Now some people will just lay cardboard down on the grass, plop their raised bed on top of the cardboard, which will smother the grass, and then add their soil, and then over the course of the growing season the cardboard will decompose. Well, that's fine if you live somewhere where you have level ground. Since we don't have a speck of level ground on our property, I had to take up the sod, which I wanted to do anyways. So we'll talk about that later when we get into the instructions on how to go through the whole process. But we took up the sod and leveled them. And then, like I say, it was 10 or 12 tractor loads of fill that went into filling the 2 of these raised beds. So what I planted cucumbers in here yesterday. And then I also made this arbor. Now this is made from just 1/2-inch conduit, and then again we switched to cedar. The arbors we made last year, I just ripped regular 2x4s, but then I had to stain them. So even though the cedar is a little more expensive, if you cut out that painting step, that saves a lot of time. And again, I think they're a little more attractive. I just used the 2x4 mesh, but that's getting ahead of myself. We'll do a video, maybe next week. I'll shoot a video on how to make these arbors, but you can make one of these for $25, $35. And they're sturdy enough. They come apart at the top so you can transport them. But we'll talk about that next week. Let's go inside, look at some pictures, and we'll go through the steps on how to build one of these things. It's much better in here. Sorry about all that wind noise outside. It's been so windy lately, I keep threatening to build a sailboat. To rip an expensive cedar board kind of takes a leap of faith, and it's a gamble either way. So choose a straight grain, dry, fairly knot-free board, and do the best you can to cut a nice straight board. Then we're going to cut 2 pieces that are 92¼ inches in length and 2 pieces that are 46¼ The 46¼ inch boards will lap over the longer boards to create the rectangular frame. So drill pilot holes for 2-inch deck screws and apply an adhesive and screw the end boards to the longer side boards. And then we're going to check the diagonals for square. It should be 105 inches each way. Then we're going to cut the 45-degree miter cuts for the cap. Now the cap pieces are going to be full 8-foot tip to tip on the sides and full 8-foot tip or 4-foot tip to tip on the ends. And then we're going to apply a bead of adhesive to the top of the frame and drill pilot holes through the cap pieces every 16 inches in about 1.25 inches from the inside. It's going to lap over 3/4 of an inch on the inside. Then we're going to drill a pilot hole for a screw in the miter ends to secure that. And then once the frame is done, it's time to install the metal. So every 8 inches we're going to mark and then use a straight edge and a marker and mark our lines. Then we're going to cut our pieces out using a metal cutting blade on an angle grinder. Being careful, use eye protection and ear protection. And then we're going to cut our 8-inch corner pieces using the 3-inch corner flashing. So here's everything we need to install the metal. I like to use these 1/2-inch lath screws for installing the metal in the cedar. So I like to go about every 4th corrugation with the screws, except for in the ends. The corners, we're going to wait until we get the corner pieces installed. And then once it's done, I like to use a 1/2-round file and take those sharp burrs off. It's still going to be sharp, but not as sharp as it was before. So then find your garden spot, plop it down, and then I like to use some spray paint to mark where it's going to be, and I use the mini cultivator to remove the sod. Get them level, and then get them filled with good quality potting soil and garden soil. And here I added the arbor. So again, that arbor, that's going to be next week's project. So how about we tackle that next week? So until then, this is Mark with Backwood Basics. Let's grow together.